Welcome to the Cities Are for Living podcast, an official podcast of the International Project Management Association. Join hosts Dr. Beverly Passian from the Netherlands and Peter Ahmad from South Africa as they explore this world of smart and livable cities. Through the stories and perspectives shared by project managers across the globe, each episode seeks to offer valuable insights, practical advice, and engaging discussions on the latest best practices in the project management field. The Cities Are for Living podcast is for project managers, built environment professionals, and community groups interested in expanding a community of practice, maximizing the impacts of projects across the globe, and enhancing the quality of life for all citizens. Welcome to this latest episode of the IPMA Cities Are for Living podcast. And in this episode, we're joined by Tika Rai. Based out of the east coast of the US of A, Tika is a highly accomplished professional with a diverse background. He's the founder of the Nepalese chapter of the IPMA and has a rich history of involvement in community development projects, including an IPMA award-winning project back in 2013. He's served multiple roles with the IPMA, including being a project assessor for the Excellence Awards, and he has extensive experience in managing and assessing projects across different continents, across different cultures, and across different disciplines. And amongst the many hats he wears, he heads up the IPMA's Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Working Group. His work emphasizes the importance of DEI in the project success and the sustainability of the developments. Throughout the conversation, Tika stresses the importance of integrating DEI at all operational levels, particularly in the case of multinational cooperation or collaborations through projects and programs. He argues that DEI will be crucial not only at the tactical level, but also at a strategic level of those operations. And I particularly enjoyed this quote from his LinkedIn profile, where he says, "When conflicts are managed well and equitable space and voices are utilized, the project team becomes vibrant, enabling each member to thrive." His own family history and career paths have undoubtedly shaped his experiences and the perspectives that he shares. And the conversation that follows makes for a refreshing and compelling listen. On a lighter note, he also discusses the IPMA's house band, the scope creeps, and the power that music has to transcend cultural and professional barriers. So next time you're at the IPMA's conference or annual event, listen out for an Adele or Pink Floyd cover at that event. Chances are it'll be Tika on vocals. As always, we really hope you enjoy the episode and would love to get your feedback. In the meantime, let's hand over to Beverly, myself, Peter Ahmad, and Tika Rai, based in America. So it's just gone 5 o'clock here in Cape Town and also 5 o'clock in Utrecht up in the Netherlands there. Beverly, how are you keeping? All good your side? Great to have you on the call again.
Yeah, everything is terrific here. I love how you pronounced Utrecht. That was terrific. Very nice.
Was it accurate?
Better than I do it, my friend. Better than I do it.
Great to be with you again, Beverly. And like our last conversation, we're crossing continents, we're crossing time zones again. I'm absolutely delighted to be crossing right across the ocean there to the east coast of the US of A and welcoming Tika Rai. Absolute pleasure to have you with us today, Tika. I think it's just gone 11 o'clock there, your time in the morning. Completely different time zone. How are you keeping? What's the weather like and how's your day been so far?
It's my grand pleasure to be here and to have this conversation going. So thanks for that. We just got out of observing Labor Day weekend, which is a 3-day weekend. That's always good. My daughter visited us. She goes to school in Boston, Massachusetts, and it was just great time, spend time with her 3 days. And we all feel like we charged back our batteries, our power, and time to rock and roll. So, and also weather-wise, the temperature has been quite high this summer, unprecedentedly. But it's now in the 70s, Fahrenheit, that is, which is relatively cooler. And I'm also enjoying that as we go back to our normality.
I really want to start, Tika, with your role and responsibility in heading up one of the SIGs. Now, again, for listeners who haven't followed this, SIGs in the IPMA world is a special interest group. You're heading up, if I understood correctly, the Diversity, Equity and Inclusion Working Group. And perhaps you want to tell us a bit about that. And then Beverly, you can come in and tell us how you got to meet Tika and bring him into this space today. But Tika, tell us a bit about that portfolio that you carry out on behalf of the IPMA.
About 3 years ago, when IPMA started the special interest group, DEI was one of the first four, I believe. And the motivation was, even with IPMA, I have multiple engagement in different roles. And one is the project assessor, for the excellence awards each year. And when I travel speaking to, your point, Peter, crossing the waters and all that, 8 different projects in different continents, which eventually won either gold or silver. Again, saw was the people at the end of the day, right? This project is all about. And diversity, for example, GE's project in France and in Malaysia. And when you assess, you go to both countries, both facilities, and you get to experience different kinds of people working with their different skill set bring into the project and how they collaborate, how that sense of belonging is there for a successful project. And it always told me that with inclusion and the diversity that you have in the workforce, how you can have equitable benefits or opportunities, things like that, and continue the growth for their professional career. And that was sort of a key point for me to say, you know what? We need to strike something about DEI in general, which would eventually be part of the addendum to our different body of knowledge that IPMA has. And that's when I said, you know what, let's get the SIG going, because the broader conversation one day we will have will implicate the importance of DEI for projects, particularly project success. So that's the backstory, Peter, if that all makes sense.
Thanks for indulging me. And Bev, tell me about how you and Tika first came to meet.
It's been at least 12 years. I think we first crossed paths, figuratively speaking, when I was the president of the Canadian Association. We were in each other's orbits a little bit, but we never really got a chance to work together until this last year. And then there are all sorts of opportunities, not the least of which, of course, is having you represent DEI in the larger smart city development conversation. What did you think when I called you up and said, would you like to be a part of a DEI initiative within smart cities conversation? What did you think?
Well, first I really appreciated, you thought of me, even though, we go back long and, on and off, we were communicating in different subject matters and all that. The 2 key points, right? One is more observation, I think, DEI, because I was already heading the SIG within IPMA blog. The other one is IEEE as an engineer, electrical that is, and I'm also a life member of IEEE. Anything as part of giving back, I have been volunteering for IPMA. I would love to do that because it kind of crossed 2 different spaces there and right on. And I just loved it. And it was a no-brainer, Bev.
It was something that you and I had in common from the beginning, this commitment to service and developing the professional circles that we run in. And it was your attention to DEI within IPMA at a much more nuanced level, I think, that could lend itself to a much richer conversation in smart city projects. How do you think a DEI perspective could influence smart city projects?
That was pretty straightforward for me because even, when I assess projects or when I manage or lead projects, the triple triangle or the iron triangle days are gone, where we say cost, quality, and time or scope. It's more about also after the fact, projects delivered, how far you push through. And if you would bring some thinking, component towards it, it even pushes the boundary further out, right? We have heard stories, doctor, treating the patient right. And the week after, the ailment comes back, or worse, people perish, because the project was a success, but it wasn't thought it through. And assessing project in Malaysia, for example, GE example, they had to uproot the community at large to place the plant, to refining the oil. That's a big project in many different ways, but uprooting a community, how does a project in project level, how does the leadership think about that, think it through, make it happen, but make it happen in the sense that where do the community go? How did they eventually, adapt it to the new environment? What was the long-term impact? Even projects, beyond projects, program, and portfolio, we still struggle from PM standpoint being constricted by that triple constraint or the iron triangle. And my push has been to push that boundary, right? So that was already there. So when we talk about smart cities, I have crossed many oceans, coming back to again, crossing the oceans metaphor there. I go to Europe, they have different way of the buildings, the toilets, the bathrooms. You go to Cape Town, it's different, right? If you go to the Netherlands, it's different. So as an engineer and as also a project lead, if I have to think of something, I really want to push beyond the boundary of the realm of the triple constraint or the iron triangle and push further out as we have this conversation and educate people or provide a platform for reflection and learning and just come have, discussions also in the smart cities realm. So that was my motivation in addition to that, the two acronyms I mentioned, DEI and IEEE, So I thought I could also bring value here, having that view and thoughts in my mind.
And you absolutely provide that value again and again and again. The notion of pushing things out, another way of looking at that is being more and more inclusive, right? And that really shouldn't have any boundaries when you are trying to develop a community as inclusively as possible. Restraints shouldn't be a part of the conversation, shouldn't be projects and the stakeholders who are benefiting from them. Their creativity needs to govern these project decisions. And it's this notion of inclusivity that really should influence those decisions, right?
Absolutely.
The inclusivity that I don't see in projects concerns a number of stakeholders. The aging population, I don't see enough in smart city project conversations, a different perspective from different gender perspectives. I don't see in smart city project conversations. What do you think about that? The lack of attention for those stakeholders?
Right, that's a great question. And I think the way I process that is when you look outside in from a project realm, because I'm also representing here IPMA SIG, project management, that is, right? So from that view, we talk about the internal organization, the leadership, the buy-ins, and the project team. I'm a big advocate of creating a community for a project. So that community project make it more successful, not just team, but community. I want my project team to be vibrant, engaging, not just a project team. I know, in a loose sense, when we say community, we think about a lot of people. It could be a team of 10 or 8 or 50. That communal thinking, how I can bring that about, right? So that's looking inside from outside. So let's turn around, 180 and look outside now. Our immediate next stop is our customers, right? It could be local government. It could be private, another company, or even internal organizational department, right? So are we making them only whatever they require, going back to triple constraint or the iron triangle? But we need to push further, right, to answer a question, Bab. So even though we are fulfilling the requirements of the immediate customer, I think we have to ask from owning that project and driving the project, how far you want to go beyond that layer. So if it's a local government and for a park, recreational park, that have we considered teenagers or kindergartners or elderly people? In my experience, when I see that, when I talk to people like that, I think that mentality of, budget, scope, quality, that triple constraint still exists strongly because it has been embedded for years and years and years. At the end of the day, the customer would ask back to us saying, we have only this much budget or this much time. What can I do? I think it's not considered in most of the cases. I think discussion group like this one, the committee that you're heading, I think that's why it's even more important to bring in people and have that conversation and see how that goes. But we are the torchbearer, if I may, right, to persist that conversation down the road to educate or create another body of knowledge. Maybe I think we're at that stage, speaking of the committee now, and that's how I would answer a question.
I want to pick up on some of these themes, Tika, and I know you put together, I think it was July this year, you posted a feature on DEI on the IPMA website. And there were some very strong themes in there, particularly around sort of the cultural differences in communications and the ability to try and navigate norms. And you've already talked about different parts of the world, different norms, different standards. Pair that with some of the pushback that I guess that we see now, this idea of a woke agenda. And that seems to be a real issue right now. And a lot of what you're talking about, the iron triangle, It's the bottom line. It's, it's got to work for the numbers and the time that's available. What you're coming at here is a far more complex and a far more intriguing approach to it, and a far more responsible way of thinking about these things. So tell us a bit about the approach that you took and your reflections on the IPMA article. But then the second part that I'm asking around, how do you navigate the challenges of this is just wokeism gone wrong? And it's like, these, I think, are some of the issues that I'm sure you face and have had to overcome in 2025.
In the blog, there are 3 key points, I've highlighted, to answer a question. The first one is the community or the communal side of the project team, which I touched briefly earlier. Second one is the future generations, right? How they are, Gen Z and beyond, how they consume the social media, the information, disinformation, and how they resonate with corporate organizations these days compared to Gen X or even baby boomers in the US case. I wanted to highlight that piece as well. And the third is the overall DEI from a project standpoint and organization standpoint versus one extreme could be going woke, even political view, So there are 3 key points I wanted to highlight. So I'm going to jump to the second one first, or maybe reverse the order, making the last one first, because I'm not going to touch on the community. It's pretty straightforward. So DEI and going woke, right? My framing of the blog is from organizational standpoint and how we deliver a project and how we need that communal sense of thing as part of the DEI. For example, being a little too crazy towards woke, how much, say, the government entity or the sponsor can support that view, plus finance that and sustain that. So there's sort of a spectrum, right? But let's be realist. And coming back to this committee's conversation as to how far we can push to also addressing requirements or needs of the elderly folks out there for a recreational park. So what's the right balance is the key thing, One can say being DEI is going woke. So for example, Harvard came into picture, big universities, Columbia came into picture, right? That's not what we are talking about here in my blog. It's more looking in towards an organization and project and why DEI matters, not in other contexts, if I may. So it's a restricted focus. If I'm not talking about the chair of this university or that government entity, but from a project organization standpoint, DEI is very, very crucial. And I'll give an example of a corporate company, which has multiple offices around the globe. Like my example, assessing a project in Malaysia versus in Italy, me being from Nepal, for example, and I have managed projects in Nepal, I have managed projects in the US. If I don't have those lenses of DEI, I cannot move as fast, as swiftly as I want. I need that frame of DEI. So that's one piece. The other is going back to the generation, right? I mean, I have 2 kids who are teenagers. Attention span is, you may have also kids or friends' kids. It's quite crazy based on, how we were educated and how we thought things. The way they resonate with the organizations are not like us. It's more, does their bottom line align with me? Does the organization has a value that I uphold? So now organizations need to also think about that for future talents coming in. If they are not DEI-ish, I think they're going to suffer. Those talents who uphold their own beliefs or perception and does not align with the organizations, I think the business entities could suffer because of that. And third, the communal piece, just briefly, again, project team versus community. I strongly believe creating a community, even though it's a small team, that sense of belonging, sense of feeling comfortable, sense of feeling safe, and bring on to your table to solve problems, have conversations. I think that's the way to go. So there are 3 elements really, Peter highlighted, in that blog I wrote in July.
Thanks for indulging us and taking us through those highlights. And I am going to just dwell for a moment before I ask Beverly to come back in on the D, the diversity. One of the privileges that we have when we have conversations with project managers, engineers around the world, we speak to people who are top of their game, very focused on one aspect of the game. Your CV is one of the most interesting I've ever come across, where we look at everything from operating in a surgery and operating theater, your technical and teaching background. You've been an electrical engineer. You've recently studied structural engineering. It's a fascinating and diverse career that you've followed. I'd love it if you can just take the listeners, Beverly and I, into your confidence. Tell us about this journey and how it's changed from within the microcosm of an operating theatre to the global stage of project management. It's absolutely fascinating. And I'm really looking forward to hearing this.
I've been lucky, and I embrace that wholeheartedly. So another side of the coin is you've been lucky, you get to do this and do that. The giving back to community should have the balance. In other words, you've been lucky, you get to do this and that. And maybe it's a gift too, I mean, I am thankful for what I was born with and worked hard towards making the best out of it, I must say. Going back to a little bit of a backstory, so I was born in pretty close from Mount Everest, actually, in Nepal, so jokingly, people think I have a bigger lungs because I was born in a high altitude area. I'm not sure about that. And my father joined the Gurkhas, the British military. And I got lucky when I was young, and we traveled to Hong Kong, Malaysia. My dad was stationed there, and then we would be stationed there for a few years and move around between Brunei, Malaysia, Hong Kong, and sometimes the UK. My sister actually is born in Ipoh, Malaysia, whereas my brother was born in Hong Kong. I was the one who was actually born in Nepal, so I'm the real Nepali, by birth. When my dad retired, we came back to Nepal, and Dad decided to stay not in the hilly mountain areas, but a little bit in the flatlands, where we would have better education access and so on. And we bought a house. We did not have electricity. We did not have TV. We had a phone. And it's one of those stories, like in a small town of 30,000 people and the two houses would have phone. And all these people will come to our place to call or receive a call. And at times I was a messenger, like, don't hang up the phone, lay on the table. I walk 15 minutes and call the neighbors, hey, your son has called from the UK or whatever. So going through that contrast, right? So being in Hong Kong, Brunei, Malaysia, color TV, sodas, you name it. I mean, access were there, right? I come back to Nepal, it's darkness. That was a head scratcher for sure. Like, wow, I mean, most of the people in Nepal at that time was going through what I was going through. Kathmandu, the capital, may have electricity, bigger cities may have electricity and all that, but the small town my dad decided to retire didn't have all that. I think that was the moment I said, you know what, I got to do something, because I got lucky. I went to Hong Kong. I had potato chips, Coca-Cola, you name it. But there are many cousins or people in Nepal, I think, need access like this. So that was my sort of a North Star, Peter, if I may, right? So then after high school, I came to the US, did my electrical engineering. I started a company. I decided to go back to Nepal because there was a calling, because that anchorage for me, not a lot of people having access to what I had when I was young. I wanted to do something about that. So I started a company in Nepal and worked with farmers. At the time, Nepal was still going through a local insurgency, civil war of some sort. 12 years, that is, right? So I went back to Nepal in 2006. The war was still going on. People thought I was crazy because people were leaving and I was coming back for good. And the company worked with the small farmers cooperatives in rural areas where people would not go. And the company still works well. So even when the company delivered a solution, which was a financial solution, it's a software program written in Nepali, okay? So farmers who could read can operate computer. And the interesting thing was at the time, because of the insurgency going on, lots of NGOs were very active in rural areas. So a social enterprise company going into rural areas, try to sell software and computer to people who have not touched a hardware like computer in their lives. So if there was no sense of equity and inclusion, that empathy piece. And I could relate to that because I was born by the mountains. When I was young, I have gone through that phases of like, wow, not having electricity. I remember so vividly the first day when I turned the switch on in my house and the light came on and we didn't have to study with candles. Can you believe that? It sounds like 1800, but it was not long ago. So I did that. So the company went really well. And actually the project won an IPMA award in 2013, one of the best community development projects. That was great accolades. Then my wife got a job offer in DC and we kind of came back. So 11 years in Nepal, came back to DC. And when I was in Nepal, by the way, started Project Management Association of Nepal, which became IPMA member. That was my gift of giving back, right? So that North Star still is in me. So when Bev called me, I'm like, I want to give back. My kids are now bound to college. I have more time now. I'm more stable. But that thinking of giving back really, Peter, got me all these opportunities from this to that. And again, maybe I was born with some gift, but what happened after was my own doing, and I love it. And I love to have people around like yourselves, and it gets me going, So that's why my resume speaks from rural farmers in Nepal to in college years. I've also won the electrical engineering's famous coveted egg drop contest, but born by the mountains. So what, right? If I could do, I should do. And having people, community around me like yourself, that gets me going, Peter.
That creative professional path has made you more sensitive to and an advocate for DEI, I think. If I could write the bio of a smart city project manager, it would very much resemble yours, I think.
Absolutely. I think, the bottom threshold of pain or whatever, it's so low when there's a conflict within a team, within the community of project, or sometimes we have issues and there's a power play being played on. I'm like Zen, like I've seen that before. I've done that before. It just provides me in such a space that nothing comes surprising. And that's an advantage for me or benefit for me to calm people down or calm the power down, stabilize. Hey, children, cool it down, that kind of thing. So I take that as a great asset that based on my experience in the view of that DEI,
Absolutely. I think, Peter, you have an example from your own experience that you might want to share?
I'm fascinated. And again, Tika, this has been an amazing conversation and listening to, the history and the rich history. And again, absolute respect to your father, part of the legendary fighting force of the Gurkhas and the service that they provided across the world. Remarkable. But I wanted to give a bit of an experience from my side in 2010, 2011, around that period of my career. I was asked to put together a youth plan for part of Johannesburg. And that was where I was working at the time. Of course, my first question was, as a planner then with probably 20 years experience or so, was what's a youth plan? What does a youth plan look like? And my boss at the time, Professor Harrison, said, Pete, it can be anything you want. You've got a blank canvas. Go design this. And what we ended up doing was starting in one of the more marginalized areas of Johannesburg, a place called Ivory Park, where it only had 3 secondary schools. For the density, it was way too few schools for the population. But we were able to cover all 3 of those schools, the geography classes. And what we did was a deep dive of their geography. Where were they traveling in from? How were they arriving? What were the challenges that they were overcoming? And again, with your structural engineering speciality in recent times, one of the things that we found was there was a river that in flood would cause chaos. And you'd actually have to traverse this river in flood with a man-made informal bridge. And the kids were being told 50 cents a time, 50 cents one way, 50 cents coming back from school. And so one of the things that came out of that was the recognition from the city. It was going to have to do something better than a troll toll gate where the kids were having to pay, a rand a day, which in an impoverished area mounts up. And so it was a really interesting exercise. Where were the good places? Where were the places they like to hang out? Where were the bad places? What sports facilities were they having to access? Things like tennis, rugby, big codes here in South Africa. Absolute zero access to those codes. So I'm just using that as an example again of when we talk about the different perspectives, different community, the youth often is talked about. And my experience, I say, even with sort of 2 decades of planning, it was like, how could I not know after 2 decades of what a youth plan? And the fact that it probably still one of the highlights of my career. I just wanted to share that with the 2 of you because I think it builds on this conversation. And just showing you an example from here in South Africa. And there are many other places around the continent, around the world, where those impoverished, those basic needs. Can I get to school free of charge in a safe environment and expect to get home safely? Yes or no? And what's the gender dynamic? Bev, I know this is your speciality. When you're a young girl as opposed to a young boy.
The focus on youth is not easily found. In my early days of my Smart City Project collection, I gathered a couple of hundred projects from the City of London. And this was a project collection about 4 to 6 years ago. And many of these projects were aimed at youth, often immigrant youth, generally speaking, young men between the ages of, say, 12 and 19, that kind of thing, giving them specific after-school activities or, a series of weekend activities. It kept them busy, of course. It gave them skills. But one of the things that really stood out for me was how little it cost. These projects are life-changing, community-enabling exercises that don't cost a lot of money, yet are few and far between in these enormous cities. Or maybe it's a communication problem or a PR problem, and they're just not sharing the details. In the early days of my project collection, the focus on youth was not easily found. Tika, you wanted to comment on that?
When I went back to Nepal, and my wife works in the community development nonprofit space, it was further humbling experiences, that things she did. Even when we returned to the US and she worked in many African countries, whatever happened 30 years ago in Nepal, some countries are going through now in Africa. So that idea of not knowing from your perspective, limited by your own environment and whatnot, see, it comes up again. And that is just mind-boggling that there are communities out there. It's one nation may have gone 50 years ago, are going through now. And there's so much out for us to do and work and to be able to transfer what you learned and did and what was a successful criteria. Without that DEI lens, you cannot transpose or translate that into different communities.
It was a point that Ben Peters made to me several years ago when I interviewed him, this notion of how do we prepare for the future if we're still dealing with the legacy of the past? And it's easy to get distracted by the Londons and the Amsterdams and the New Yorks and these wonderful, wonderful cities. But the true area for growth, meaningful sharing of lessons between cities are from the small to medium-sized cities and even beyond that to these more rural communities. So I think the three of us could write an interesting column, perhaps, for IPMA's blog. But
perhaps we should.
Yeah, perhaps we should. I'd like to switch gears just a little bit. You mentioned early on your role as an award assessor. I'm curious what you might think of criteria for, well, maybe not even criteria, but a basic description of what a smart city project could be if it were to receive an award by IPMA. If you were to design the IPMA Smart City Project Award, what might that look like?
That's a great question. All right. The first off, all the project assessment happens based on what IPMA calls the Project Excellence Model. It's a framework, and there's a dial under that, we have different criteria, the people, purpose, and project. That's like meeting the criteria. So the new weightage, for improving the chances of winning BEV would be the sustainability guide or sustainability piece of the project, because IPMA did publish the sustainability early this year. And now that's a huge undertaking in terms of how we incorporate that also in Project Excellence Model. The document is not updated yet, the Project Excellence Model, but that criteria would really, I think, put a bigger weightage in addition to the framework. So my advice guidance would be your project. From the sound of it itself, and their sustainability piece, we're thinking about, hey, how about even elderly people for a toilet or a park in a community? I think that you have more things to share in that area anyway. Make the most out of it, Beth.
Yeah, I appreciate that. And it is, as I say, something that you and I will be returning to.
So Tika, as we start to bring the conversation to an end, and hopefully this is not the first and last time the three of us chat, but anything else that you'd like to share before we start to wrap?
Just one last thing, it has nothing to do with the main theme of the topic, but going back to my point, having community around me, people like yourself, and we have to celebrate, we have to take, the greatest joy we can. In that regard, I love music. Actually, we have an accidental band within the IPMA. We call it Scope Creeps. During the IPMA World Congress, actually, we performed, and it was wonderful to share the joy of music and celebrate humanity overall. So this year's World Congress is being held in Berlin, Germany. Unfortunately, we didn't get a spot to play. I would have loved to play another Brick in the Wall in Berlin, but we're going to jam anyway, probably on the side event or something like that, just to share, celebrate, music, because I'm not a native English speaker, but I love all kinds of music. So just sharing that layer too, Peter.
Well, it's actually an important point that I can tie back to smart city development. When I studied the city of Dortmund, my contact there was very proud of the cultural events that happened within the city. And he was proud of the musical acts and various artists that participated and showed their unique talents. But he said it wasn't the artistic endeavor that the city was truly cultivating. It was the goodwill with the citizens. That was the goal. Yes, of course, the celebration of music and the celebration of the arts and all of that was absolutely of critical importance. But the city saw those endeavors as a way to establish a stronger relationship with the citizens whose lives they were trying to make better. So I'm not sure if the scope creeps are generating goodwill amongst IPMA membership, but that's certainly part of the plan of creative cities like Dortmund, and certainly here in Utrecht.
Good point, Bev. And I hope we are, from a view of different lenses, people perceive, different culture and all that. Imagine a 5'5" Nepali man, on the stage, picking up a guitar and singing Adele's song. I have a pretty high-pitched note. It's just mind-boggling for some other people. I'm not saying I'm the best, but that perspective alone is worthy of discussion, how people have different things and views of people from other cultures. So I always get a good kick out of that kind of perspective and conversation after the fact.
I love the way that you've linked another brick in the wall. There's your structural engineer coming rushing to the front. Tika, what a pleasure. What a fascinating and deep dive we've had with you on these issues. And again, thank you so much for sharing. And I really would love us to pick up some of these themes again in the future. And I'm sure, Beverly, we can work towards that. I think we've talked about the idea of bringing maybe a bit of a panel together, discussing some of these issues across the episodes as we go. But this has been absolutely fascinating, revealing on so many different levels. But Bev, do you want to start to wrap up, and then we can say thanks to Tika?
I do, absolutely. But I wanted to make the point of DEI leadership. There are dedicated DEI leaders in cities that also score highly on quality of life. Vancouver and Sydney, Australia being two of them. There are dedicated professionals who've scoped out a DEI strategy for their city. Much of these strategies has vibrant cultural elements in it. So I think the notion of getting a panel together with you, Tika, and other leaders of DEI could be an interesting future conversation.
Tika, from my side, thank you so much. I say a pleasure and a privilege to host you today. We're going to say good night or good morning to you there. Good night to you, Beverly. Speak to you again soon, and looking forward to the next episode. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tika.
Thank you, Peter and Bev. Yeah, it has been lovely. Talk soon.
Talk soon.
We hope you've enjoyed this episode of the Cities Are for Living podcast of the IPMA, the International Project Management Association. Please feel free to send us feedback, your thoughts on the content we provided, and if you'd like to get involved via sur@ipma.world. The SUR standing for Smarter Urban Rural, one of the task teams that's alluded to in one of our pilot episodes. So sur@ipma.world. We'd love to hear your feedback, and please get in contact. Tell us what you think.